Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josiah Fritz. I'll be hosting the Lunch and Learn today. So let's go ahead and get started. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer. Happy to answer any questions that anybody has today. All right, here's a question. What is the difference between using an entity and a simple database structure? So the key difference between these two data types is the features that decisions brings along with it. At its most simple level, simple database structure exists as a table in the database. You can build actions onto it in decisions, but ultimately it just lives in the database. For an entity, the entity also lives, in addition to living in the database in a table, it also lives in decisions in the portal, so that I can navigate to a folder and see a list of entities and have the actions appear there. And they actually, when I create an entity, I have to specify where in decisions it lives. Where that becomes really useful is automatically creating a relationship between data, because I can take an entity and I can put it in a folder, and now that entity is linked to its folder, to the parent object by the nature of being in that folder. So I can go to a folder and say, if I've got a one-to-many relationship that I want to define in decisions, I can use that by creating a folder and putting entities inside of it and having them related that way. All right, let's see. Here's another question. Is there a trigger that allows mouse clicks on a report? If you double click on a report line to select that line and send enter to move on to the next step. Scott, can you come off mute and give me a little bit more info on what you're looking for there?
Yeah, so we are using an advanced data grid as a selection tool. So the scenario is we're doing a member search, and you might get multiple members returned in the search, and so the user has to pick the correct one. Currently, you click on the member to select them, and then you click on the OK button or whatever the next button is. And just wondering if there's we've used other triggers, to default the enter button, to proceed to the next one, or escape to cancel, things like that. And the question was, can we do like a double click on the report to select the line? I couldn't find one.
So that, like, if you're in the form and you've got that advanced data grid, you want to just be able to double click on one of those and have it automatically select it and close that part of the form and go back to, like, you're doing it at like a sub dialog or something like that, or you just want to move the form along where someone's there and you select it and it automatically hits enter for you.
Right.
That is a good question. You can define some triggers when you're setting up a form. I don't know if it lets you do double click as one.
Yeah,
We can take a look.
I couldn't find any mouse action triggers. There's they're basically, you can do any kind of key trigger, but I just couldn't find any mouse actions. I just didn't know if it existed.
Well, let's take a look.
Cool.
And let's see here. Where's my lunch and learn example folder? There we go. Let's see. Yeah, so we can do it. We want to trigger the action of the button. But I think you're right. You can set a key on there. You could set it to the enter key where you select it and then do enter.
Yep.
But I don't think that we currently have double click. I can put in a feature request for that if you'd like to add double click as a potential trigger or a shortcut key there, but it doesn't look like we currently support it.
Okay. Yeah, if you'd float that, that'd be great. That was kind of our workaround, was you can select it and hit enter. So I mean, that's I think for what we're trying to do, I think that's a reasonable workaround. So
okay, yeah, I'd be happy to get a feature request in for that.
Cool. Thank you.
Let me just make a note of that real quick. All right, next question. Is the Advanced Data Grid a new control in version 7? The Advanced Data Grid, I believe, actually was introduced in version 6, but the Advanced Data Grid is basically a replacement to the old Decisions Data Grid that's styled and formatted and actually built in the same way as the report in Decisions. So rather than having a control that's a specific data grid thing, and then our reporting engine, you can actually now use the advanced data grid to build form controls that look much more like our proper reports and get a lot more functionality into what's happening in that grid. So I believe it's introduced as early as at least in version 6. Let me check here. Yeah, so there it is, Data Grid Advanced. It may also be in 5, I'm not sure. But so what happens when I set this up is just like when I'm setting up a data grid, I'm going to give this thing a type here. And let's say I'm going to create this as an account. And it's going to give me some options here. What's the data that I want to pass in here? I have an option here if I want to pick up actions. So if the object that I'm using has entity actions defined on it, I can actually tie that to the advanced data grid here. But what I'm going to get now is I'm going to get a source report, and this is actually going to open up the report editor. And now instead of having to do, the data grid where the old data grid where you had to kind of select which columns you wanted and do a little bit of formatting like in the form component in the form editor, you now get the full report editor, and I can define how I want this data to look. Now, you'll notice that it is a little bit more stripped down here than the full report editor. I can't change what data source that I have available to me because that's actually tied to the form control that I just created. It says this is an advanced data grid that is using accounts. So that's limited there. But I can now build this thing just like I would any other report, and I can put the fields in that I want. I can format them how I want, and I can have them show up on my form as if it were a report that were shown on that form.
Is there any advantage to the older data grid compared to the advanced data grid?
There's not, and we really recommend that as you're building forms going forward, that you kind of move over to the advanced data grid. We're not fully depreciating the existing one because we don't want to break people's forms that have them on there. But going forward, like a lot of the support and new features around the functionality of how data grids show up on forms will be in the advanced data grid rather than the old version of it.
So I noticed in this advanced one, you've got this filters add button, which I am familiar with from the report, of course. So we have filtering powers here as well.
Yes, so you'll have, like, we can put the data in here. Now, the difference here, the main difference, right, is when you're setting up a normal report, this account data source is going to look at the table and see what's in there, and you would put the filters onto it here. When you're using the advanced data grid, really what you'll do and where you would do the filtering of your data largely would be what data you actually pass in here. So I now have this account list option. So if I put this into a form, I can pass in the account list that I want to show up in this data grid. So the input to it is now going to be from here. I'm actually not sure. Let me check and see if the filter here applies, or if that's just an artifact of the fact that this is using the report editor.
Well, the one other way you could look at is, for example, it would be, for example, maybe you could say, check that hidden is false or something like that. With the idea of, yeah, the input list has everything, but I'm only going to show a subset. And when you're done interacting with it, the output then would still have that same input list potentially, right? In as much as the user didn't see it, but it did pass through the form. That would be another.
That's an interesting use case that you need to be careful of, because if you've got a user and they're interacting with data on a form in some way, right? Us passing data in, but not actually showing it. So like if we're doing any kind of manipulation on that list, the list that a user was viewing would be different than the list that Decisions was actually interacting with. So, you could go in there and let's say you've got this form and you're adding or deleting accounts, and you've got a filter on there that's hiding some of them, and you go in there, you need to clean out all of the accounts in a group or whatever, something like that, right? The input list that you give it is accounts in a particular group,
Right.
and now someone goes in and they delete them all, but there was some filter on the report, and so they didn't see some of them, so they haven't deleted them. So the list that Decision still has says there are still some accounts in that group, even though
Well,
the user experience would be that there aren't.
I had a very different hack in mind, which would be that I would add to my entity sort of what sometimes in my entity I put what I call UI fields, which are never have a value in the database, but I use them internally to kind of keep tabs on what's what. So I have this idea of, well, I could add a flag UI delete, as it were, and so everybody comes in with UI delete false. But when they click the delete button, what happens is we go through a flow where we go find that one we said is flagged to true, come back to the form, and then update the advanced data grid content, right? But because of the rule, the one that has now been set to true doesn't show up to the user. But when they hit save instead of cancel, I can then look at a record and say, the user told me to delete this one, so let me just go take care of that for you. See what I mean?
I see. So yeah, I think there is some potential there. Let me debug this real quick and see which way those filters, like if the filters are applied. And it looks like it did apply the filter.
So he says if I make that filter always true, then, well, okay, now your question is, do we get a filtered output as opposed to a everything output?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to check here. Now the input here, okay, so I get the whole list in.
I think if you collapse the list, it'll tell you the count.
Yep, okay, so it is passing in the whole list, it's filtering it, and then it's giving me the whole list back out again. So the filter does apply, but it only applies to what's actually shown there, not the data that exists in there.
Right, but I can leverage that in exactly the way I was discussing.
Yep, absolutely. So I think, yeah, there's definitely some powerful ways that can be used. My only warning there would be careful, because the data that's shown isn't necessarily the data that is going to be passed out of the form. So you would have the potential to get some confusion there as from a user, what they're seeing and what's actually happening in the flow.
Yeah, I get what, yeah, I mean, when you, it gets very confusing for users when what they're seeing is not the whole truth. And then, and then the result is out of step with what they saw in the form. All right.
I'm actually curious if we can expose those filters now. If we make that runtime editable.
What does that do, he says? But when it comes to things like, okay, so one of the other features, yeah, I'm curious to see what happens here too. I'll ask after.
It looks like it didn't give it to us as an input to the form. I was curious if it would.
Well, I also imagine, though, the other question would be, if you actually debug it, do you see something appear in the form that lets the user fiddle with it? My hunch is no.
No, I don't believe so.
Although curious that you get the like the filter piece that you see, like.
Well, that's because I didn't clear out what I had defined there. So even though I told it to be runtime editable, I still have that set.
But I saw in the column header briefly the option to sort and also filter.
Yes. So those controls there are, whoops, that's not what I want. Are because it's now using the report engine. So this filter and like this column sort and the group are the controls that you get, on any column in the normal report editor. So you can use that to filter down the data that's actually being displayed here, or to sort the data that's being displayed here as you need.
All right. Then one other quick question about advanced versus the regular. I know one of the modes in the regular one is data entry. Does the new one support that too?
Let's see, because we change. There is an inline edit.
There is an inline edit.
So Josiah, you're also going to have to say that that field in the report designer is editable as well. And then you can start typing into it. Yeah, I had the same question when I was messing around with the advanced grid, and I didn't figure that out until I banged my head against it a couple times and set the
there we go.
to
Can
check
edit.
Yeah. I will say the cool thing about that is if you do have like any dates that you're going to be using, you can also, it will have a date picker for that one. So let's say if Josiah had the created on date selected here and he said that field was can edit, then when he double left clicks it, it will have a date picker that he can pick a new date too. So it's a pretty cool feature.
Interesting.
And I also believe if you, when he submits the form, I don't think it overwrites the data. It just changes the way that data looks as it's outputted into the flow designer. So if you actually want to have that user value saved, then Josiah or your developer would have to have a selective update step to actually edit
you would
that new
need
value.
a step in the flow to save the data back to the database if you actually wanted to overwrite the values that were there.
Yeah, I would expect that whatever edits the user made would be reflected in the output of the form.
Yep, exactly.
And then it's up to you to take said output and, as it were, save it. Now, is there a single step that will commit all those changes, or?
So if you wanted to save the entire list, you could pass it into a save entities step. The save entities will actually let you define a type here. So I could say this is account. I could type. And if I tell it that I want this to save multiple entities, I could give it that entire list and it would write all of those entries back into the database.
Now that brings up the question of what happens to things like the user said, remove this from the list. I mean, those would not be deleted on your behalf though, would they?
Not with this step, no.
But anything that was changed would be updated, and anything that was not changed would be left alone.
Yep, that is correct. If you wanted to, like if you had that list and you were using it and like you wanted to delete any entries that had been deleted out of the list, you would either need to, on that form, build up a list of the ones that were deleted, marked for deleted, something like that. And I think that's the case you mentioned with the filter, right? They mark it as deleted. You update a flag in memory on the object and say is deleted, and the report is filtered to not show the things that are deleted. We get out of here and then we say filter the list down to the ones that flag was set on and delete them, or compare the two lists. So you compare the list that's output, right? We just remove the thing from the list in memory. We get it out and we say, look at the list that we got out versus the list that we started with in the flow and see which items don't appear anymore. And those are the ones that we want to delete.
Yeah, I think the second one is what we are often doing, that we'll actually keep a list of the IDs that go in and then kind of use that to figure out, well, which IDs are going to get or have been omitted, therefore deleted. I think that's actually something we do a fair amount of. Interesting, thanks.
Yep. All right. Any other questions today?
I actually have a question from the decision side. So earlier today, I was messing around with integrations, and I noticed that there are some integrations that I defined that I didn't need to deserialize the data that came from the REST call. So I guess my question is, are there certain types of integration calls when I output that data and the integration and the system I'm integrating with is decisions? Are there certain configurations where I don't have to deserialize the data and I can just get direct access to that data? And then what are those situations?
So when you're setting up your REST call, you can actually tell the call to give you back an object instead of giving you back a JSON string. And it'll automatically give it to you as the object. So you don't need a deserialized step in the flow.
Gotcha. So if I define it as just an object and pass that out, then I won't need to deserialize it. But if I serialize it via the JSON or XML serialize and then deserialize it later, then I'd have to use it.
Yeah, so for
Gotcha.
example, if I'm setting up an integration, and let me add a method here. So when I'm adding this method, the step output value here, I can tell it I want that raw value, which is going to give me, the text if it's JSON or XML, depending on what the service is getting back. If I say select data type, I can tell it that I want to map it into a type that I've got created. And it's going to ask me what format I'm deserializing from. Is it JSON or XML? But I can have the integration automatically do that deserialization for me, so I don't need to do it on a step in the flow after following the integration.
Gotcha. Okay, that was the disconnect that I mentioned. Okay, so that's why. So if I set it here, decisions will deserialize the data for me. If I just want the raw JSON or XML, then I'd have to use the deserialized flow step associated with it to get that.
Exactly. Yep.
Got it. Okay, that makes so much more sense now.
All right. Any other questions today? Okay. So advanced data grids allow actions. You don't see it in 6.12. That is a good question. So where that option is, let me pull that form back up, is on the advanced data grid, there should be a show actions underneath that grid mode. So Scott, if you don't see that, that feature may not have been added yet in 6.12.
Okay.
It also might be dependent on the type that you've got selected. Like if I select something like a non-composite type, let me look at my user-defined types here and see if that's something that's specific. Nope, that does have it. Let's see if I've got a simple database structures here. Okay, so that one doesn't have it. So it looks like it's dependent on the type of data type. And I wonder if it's
Mine's
whether
mine's a case entity.
yours is a case entity. So case entity, do you have actions defined on the case?
I believe I do, yes.
My cases don't appear. to have it either.
Okay.
That is interesting. I don't know if that is intentional or if it has something to do with the type of data. I can do some digging into that, Scott.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that is a bug and it just, for some reason, the option isn't exposed there, or if there's some underlying functionality that there's a reason that a case doesn't have its actions available to show up.
Okay. And as far as like in the grid itself, and I've done this with other advanced data grids. So essentially, you want to filter the result based on an input, and that's pretty straightforward usually. I don't know if I might just have to fiddle around with the inputs. Sorry, that wasn't really a question. I think I can get it to do what I want. I'm just not getting there yet. So
Okay.
that was an unfortunate of I had the mic at the wrong moment. So I'll
No
fiddle
worries.
around with it. If I can't make it work, I'll ask in another place.
Okay. Any other questions this afternoon? All right. Well, if there's no other questions for today, we will be back again tomorrow and happy to answer any other questions that you may have. All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon.